Lecture 10, The Chicago Speech, July 1858.
Welcome back. In the last lecture, we focused on the House Divided speech, which I tried to reposition as not a prediction of civil war, which Lincoln explicitly denied, but as a warning that Douglas was part of a plot to lead the entire country toward nationwide slavery. At the end of the lecture, I suggested that Douglas saw this speech as a great opportunity to put Lincoln on record as being an abolitionist. And indeed, the interplay between Douglas and Lincoln is an important part of the weeks that would follow. When Lincoln delivered the House Divided speech, Congress was still in session. And so according to the conventions of that time, Douglas could not yet open his own campaign or reply to the speech. But a few weeks later, Congress adjourned, and after spending a couple days in New York, Douglas returned to Illinois, where he opened his campaign on the 9th of July with a speech that he gave in Chicago. He devoted most of the speech to attacking Lincoln's doctrine in the House Divided speech. After referring to Lincoln as an old friend and calling him a kind, amiable, and intelligent gentleman, Douglas tore into the House Divided doctrine. He contended that Lincoln was calling for uniformity among all the states and territories in all of their domestic relations. And he suggested that since Lincoln clearly was opposed to slavery, the uniformity that he must be calling for was abolition. And referring to Lincoln's statement that the country could not exist permanently half slave and half free, Douglas said, why not? Why can't it exist in the condition that our fathers made it, half slave and half free? So in that speech, Douglas did a couple of things. He went on the attack against Lincoln, making Lincoln's House Divided speech, rather than his own Senate record, the issue in the campaign, and he tried to suggest that Lincoln was deviating from the course represented by the Founding Fathers. It's worth noting at this point that both men, both Lincoln and Douglas, have claimed that the position that they support is the one that the Founding Fathers championed. Lincoln claiming that they believed that slavery was in the course of ultimate extinction, Douglas claiming that they believed the country could exist half slave and half free. Lincoln was in the audience when Douglas spoke on the 9th of July, and he announced that he would speak at the same place the following night for people who would like to hear his views on the question. And Lincoln's first major speech in the campaign following the House Divided speech is the one that he delivered in Chicago on the 10th of July, 1858. And it's that speech that I want to focus on in this lecture. This speech reveals a couple of things. It reveals Lincoln as a campaigner trying to place Douglas on the defensive and in a weak rhetorical position. But at the same time, it reveals Lincoln's need to explain himself after Douglas has so strongly attacked the House Divided speech. And I think we can see these two dimensions of Lincoln's speech pretty clearly if we take the elements in the speech somewhat out of chronological order. So let me begin with Lincoln's attempt to put Douglas on the defensive, to put Douglas in a weak rhetorical position. Lincoln does so by noting that Douglas supports popular sovereignty and also supports the Dred Scott decision. And Lincoln suggests that there is a clear contradiction here. Referring to popular sovereignty, he says, Douglas talks about this as though this were a great principle, but today it has been decided. No more than a year ago it was decided by the Supreme Court of the United States and is insisted upon today that the people of a territory have no right to exclude slavery from a territory, that if any one man chooses to take slaves into a territory, all the rest of the people have no right to keep them out. This being so, how much is left of this vast matter of squatter sovereignty? So he says, look, Douglas, you're deceiving people by claiming to support popular sovereignty when the Dred Scott decision has invalidated popular sovereignty. But not only that, he notes that Douglas endorses the Dred Scott decision. Now that's clear proof to Lincoln that Douglas is being hypocritical in championing popular sovereignty when he knows full well that the Dred Scott decision, which he supports, knocks it out. But he's not content there. He then ridicules Douglas for claiming that the Dred Scott decision has some kind of sacred status. He says, the seal is absolutely put down upon popular sovereignty by the court decision, and Judge Douglas puts his on the top of that, yet he is appealing to the people to give him vast credit for his devotion to popular sovereignty. That's the proof of his hypocrisy. And then the belittling of Douglas comes in this phrase. Lincoln says, the sacredness that Judge Douglas throws around this decision, Dred Scott, is a degree of sacredness that has never been before thrown around any other decision. I have never heard of such a thing. And then referring to Dred Scott, it is the first of its kind. It is an astonisher in legal history. It is a new wonder of the world. It is based upon falsehood in the main as to the facts, and decisions like this have always needed confirmation before the lawyers regarded it as a settled law. Remember that the principle of judicial review has not yet been firmly established. But Judge Douglas will have it that all hands must take this extraordinary decision made under these extraordinary circumstances and give their vote in Congress in accordance with it. In other words, Douglas is proposing that the Dred Scott decision be treated in a way that Supreme Court decisions have never been treated before. And then, as he had done in earlier speeches, Lincoln tries to turn the tables on Douglas by pointing out that 25 years ago, the Supreme Court had held a national bank to be constitutional, in spite of which President Andrew Jackson effectively killed the national bank, and Douglas supported him. So Lincoln muses, circumstances alter cases. Now, notice what Lincoln has done so far. He's tried to put Douglas in an inconsistency, supporting popular sovereignty and also supporting the Dred Scott decision. Now, logically, if a person supports inconsistent positions, it means they can't both be true. But Lincoln goes on to undercut both parts of Douglas's position. He says, you can't support popular sovereignty anymore because Dred Scott knocks it out, and you shouldn't endorse Dred Scott because it's such an astonishing deviation from the course of legal history up until now. So this is his first attempt to place Douglas in a weak rhetorical position. Then he takes up the Lecompton Constitution. Douglas has been saying much about the fact that he opposed the Lecompton Constitution. And Lincoln, as he has done in other speeches, tries to belittle Douglas for this opposition. Now, previously, he had belittled Douglas by saying that the difference between Douglas and Buchanan was a mere trifle. Now he takes a different position. He says, Douglas is claiming credit for opposing the Lecompton Constitution, but the Republicans have also opposed the Lecompton Constitution. In fact, the Republicans furnished more votes against the Lecompton Constitution than Douglas did. So why should the credit belong to Douglas? Douglas claims such vast credit, Lincoln said. I agree that in opposing the Lecompton Constitution, so far as I can perceive, he was right. I do not deny that at all. I don't readily see how I could deny it, but I don't wish to, for all the Republicans in the nation opposed it, and they would have opposed it just as much without Judge Douglas's aid as with it. And then he proceeds at some length to talk about how Republicans gave more votes against Lecompton than Douglas had done. Yet another way that Lincoln tries to put Douglas in a weak rhetorical position is to comment upon a claim that Douglas had made toward the end of his Chicago speech. Lincoln puts this one at the beginning of his speech because he's afraid he'll forget about it if he doesn't mention it first. One of Douglas's complaints was that there was a plot, a conspiracy. There are many conspiracies at work in these speeches. Douglas had claimed that there was a conspiracy, an unholy alliance between the supporters of Buchanan and the Republicans to try to defeat him, Douglas. This, by the way, is a charge for which there is some evidence to support it. And Douglas had said, this being the case, he wasn't going to distinguish among his various opponents, and he drew an analogy to the Crimean War, in which the Russians did not worry about whether the attacks came from Britain or France or wherever. They responded to them all the same. Listen to what Lincoln says in reference to this. He says, well, now, gentlemen, is not that very alarming? Just to think of it. Right at the outset of his canvass, I, a poor, kind, amiable, intelligent gentleman, I am to be slain in this way. Why, my friend the judge is not only, as it turns out, not a dead lion, nor even a living one, he is the rugged Russian bear. Well, you see, Lincoln has made fun of Douglas's referring to him as a kind, amiable, and intelligent gentleman, suggesting that Douglas is a hypocrite. The reference to the living dog and dead lion goes back to the House Divided speech. He now makes Douglas out to be a Russian bear. He points out that Douglas has used an unfortunate analogy because in the Crimean War battle that he's talking about, the Allies won. And then finally he speaks directly to the matter of an alliance with the Buchanan forces and says there's no formal alliance, but to the degree that the Buchanan men want Douglas defeated for one reason and the Republicans want him defeated for a different reason, why, if there is a concert in the interests among them, why, so much the better. And then the last thing that Lincoln does to try to weaken Douglas's rhetorical position is an interesting maneuver. You remember that in an earlier speech, Lincoln had talked about whether Negroes were included as men in the Declaration of Independence. And he pointed out that Douglas had claimed that they were not, and that according to Douglas's view, what all men are created equal in the Declaration meant is that people in the colonies had the same rights as the people in Great Britain. Now look at how clever Lincoln is politically with this reference by Douglas. He's going to use it in this speech to try to drive a wedge between Douglas and the immigrants to Illinois. The immigrants particularly from Germany who have swelled the population of Illinois in the last several years. Now you might ask, what does one thing have to do with the other? Well, let's follow Lincoln's argument along. He refers to the 4th of July when we celebrate the Declaration of Independence and says there are a lot of people among us who are the descendants of those who wrote the Declaration. But then he adds, we have besides these men descended by blood from our ancestors, among us perhaps half our people who are not descendants at all of these men. They are men who have come from Europe, German, Irish, French, and Scandinavian, men that have come from Europe themselves or whose ancestors have come hither and settled here, finding themselves our equals in all things. And Lincoln says, even though their ancestors weren't the signers of the Declaration, they have claimed the Declaration's pledge of equality for themselves. But what happens if you read the Declaration in the way that Douglas reads it? We have him, Douglas, saying that the people of America were equal to the people of England. According to this construction, you Germans are not connected with it. And Lincoln proceeds to argue that by Douglas's reading of the Declaration of Independence, all of these immigrants from other parts of Europe are assigned by Douglas to the same status of inferior race that Douglas has assigned to the Negro. Now, we might think of this as something of a cheap shot, but it's a clever political move. Lincoln is trying to claim for himself the immigrant vote, which, as he says, could make up as much as half the population. So the maneuvers that Lincoln has made, he's put Douglas in a contradiction and knocked out both sides of it, both popular sovereignty and Dred Scott. He's belittled Douglas's break with Buchanan over Lecompton. He has ridiculed the charge that there is an alliance between Republicans and Buchanan supporters without ever directly denying it. and he's tried to alienate Douglas from the immigrant vote. So far, so good. We might say that these are the sorts of maneuvers that one would expect of a challenger who's trying to unseat a powerful incumbent. But it's also interesting to note that in this speech, Lincoln spends a good deal of time in what we can only regard as defensive maneuvers, suggesting that Douglas's speech the night before has had some effect. Now, when I say these are defensive maneuvers, don't misunderstand me. Lincoln certainly continues to attack Douglas, but he does so in the context of trying to clarify his own views on the House divided doctrine. He starts off by saying that he, like Douglas, believes in popular sovereignty, but true popular sovereignty comes from the Declaration of Independence and is distinct from Douglas's squatter sovereignty notion. Then he spends a good deal of time trying to deny the main charge that Douglas has made, that is, that Lincoln favors uniformity in all the institutions of the states, and that this must mean that Lincoln is an abolitionist. He first of all suggests that he does not favor uniformity at all. Referring to Douglas, he says, I am in favor of making all the states of this union uniform in all their internal regulations. He says that I am in favor of making war by the North upon the South for the extinction of slavery, that I'm also in favor of inviting, as he expresses it, the South to a war upon the North for the purpose of nationalizing slavery. Now, these are things that Douglas had said in the speech before. This is what Douglas thought the House divided doctrine meant. And so how does Lincoln answer? Well, he first answers him, I suppose, as a lawyer might, by insisting upon a distinction. Lincoln says, in the House divided speech, I didn't say that I favored any of these things. I simply made a prediction as to what would happen, that the country would either become all slave or that the public mind would again rest confident that slavery was in the course of ultimate extinction. So I didn't favor any of these things. I just made a prediction. But he did, in order that he not be drawn away from his main point, he did say now that I desire that slavery should be put in the course of ultimate extinction. But he points out how different that is from Douglas's construction. That he's not calling for uniformity, he's not calling for civil war, he's calling for returning to the view of the fathers. Now remember, Douglas has claimed the view of the fathers for himself. And so Lincoln responds directly to that. He says, I'm well aware that the country has endured for 82 years half slave and half free. He says, how could that be? I believe it has endured because during all that time, until the introduction of the Nebraska bill, the public mind did rest all the time in the belief that slavery was in course of ultimate extinction. So the reason the country could exist until now is that until Douglas introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act, everybody believed that slavery eventually would die out, and that's the view that Lincoln wants to identify with the Founding Fathers. So we have a clear clash developing now on the question of what the Founding Fathers would have thought. Lincoln also specifically denies that he's an abolitionist. He says, I have said 100 times, and I have now no inclination to take it back, that I believe there is no right and ought to be no inclination in the people of the free states to enter into the slave states and interfere with the question of slavery at all. I have said that always. Judge Douglas has heard me say it. If not quite 100 times, at least as good as 100 times. And when it is said that I'm in favor of interfering with slavery where it exists, I know it is unwarranted by anything I've ever intended, and as I believe by anything that I've ever said. I know that I never meant any such thing, and I believe that no fair mind can infer any such thing from anything I have ever said. Now notice the pains to which Lincoln goes to deny this claim that he's an abolitionist in order, he hopes, to be able to get rid of it and prevent Douglas or anybody else from claiming it from here on out. So he has no right to interfere, but he again refers to the significance of the public mind, which Douglas has tried to overturn. Now, Lincoln in this speech is trying in defending himself to appeal not only to the more radical, but also to the more moderate factions within his party. He appeals to the old line Whigs. He says explicitly in the speech that he has always been an old line Whig. As he put it, I hate slavery as much as any abolitionist, but as an old line Whig, I respected it where it currently exists. On the other hand, he makes clear that unlike Douglas, he does not view slavery as a matter of moral indifference. He says, the judge thinks that it's a small thing, but there is a vast portion of the American people that do not look upon that matter as being this very little thing. They look upon it as a vast moral evil. They can prove it as such by the writings of those who gave us the blessings of liberty which we enjoy, namely the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And he refutes Douglas's contention that the Negro was not considered a man for purposes of the Declaration. Not only does he point out, as I suggested above, that this would exclude the immigrants, but he goes much beyond that. And he says that if we take the view that the Negro is not a man, we put ourselves on a slippery slope that leads us to absolute tyranny, such as we associate with the monarchies of Europe. He says, if that course of argumentation that is made for the purpose of convincing the public mind that we should not care about this should be granted, it does not stop with the Negro. I should like to know if taking this old Declaration of Independence, which declares that all men are equal upon principle, and making exceptions to it, where will it stop? If one man says it does not mean a Negro, why may not another say it does not mean some other man? And he proceeds to say, well, if the Declaration is not the truth, then let's get it and tear it out of the statute books. And he says, who is so bold to do it? If it is not true, let us tear it out. And of course the crowd cries out, no, no. So he says, let us stick to it then. Let us stick firmly to it then. So he directly denies Douglas's claim that the Negro was not considered a man for purposes of the Declaration. And in his peroration, in the conclusion of the speech, Lincoln comes out in a very strong way on principle, in a way that would appeal to the more radical members of his party. Lincoln begins by referring to the Bible. He says, the Savior, I suppose, did not expect that any human creature could be perfect as the Father in heaven. But he said, as your Father in heaven is perfect, be ye also perfect. He set that up as a standard. And he who did most toward reaching that standard attained the highest degree of moral perfection. And now Lincoln argues an analog to the slavery question. So I say, in relation to the principle that all men are created equal, let it be as nearly reached as we can. If we cannot give freedom to every creature, let us do nothing that will impose slavery on any other creature. And then building upon that, in the final lines of the speech, he said, let us discard all this quibbling about this man and the other man, this race and the other race being inferior, and therefore they must be placed in an inferior position. Let us discard all these things and unite as one people throughout this land until we shall once more stand up declaring that all men are created equal. I leave you hoping that the lamp of liberty will burn in your bosoms until there shall no longer be a doubt that all men are created free and equal. By the way, Douglas is going to have fun later on with those remarks as well. But what Lincoln has tried to do so far is he's tried to respond to the charges that Douglas has made against him, that he's an abolitionist who favors uniformity. He responds to Douglas's claim that the Negro is not included in the Declaration of Independence. He denies that he's an abolitionist and says he has no right to go into the southern states, but at the same time he appeals to the values that would be supported by the more radical members of the Republican Party. But Lincoln is still not convinced, I suspect, that he has answered Douglas completely, because there is a section in the speech in which Lincoln pleads directly with Republicans not to support Douglas. When Douglas had talked about an alliance between the Buchanan men and the Republican leaders, Lincoln focused on Douglas's use of the word leaders and said it's only the leaders of the Republican Party that Douglas denounces. The rank and file he's appealing to because he thinks the rank and file might vote for him. And so Lincoln takes pains to urge Republicans in his audience not to do that. He says, I want to ask your attention, addressing myself to the Republicans here, that I may ask you some questions as to where you as the Republican Party would be placed if you sustained Judge Douglas in his present position by re-election. Now let me stop for just a second to notice it's odd, isn't it, in a campaign speech for Lincoln as the Republican candidate to be asking such a question? He wouldn't ask such a question if he weren't worried about the fact that Douglas's siren song might appeal to some Republicans. And so he does ask them, where would you be if you went along with Douglas? And he answers his question by saying, if you endorse him, you tell him that you do not care whether slavery be voted up or down. Remember in the House Divided speech, Lincoln had said, Douglas is claiming as a principle of public policy that you shouldn't care if slavery is voted up or voted down. And I mentioned then that this was taken out of context, but Lincoln uses it effectively. So now he says, any Republican who votes for Douglas is saying that the Republican doesn't care if slavery is voted up or voted down. Not content with that, Lincoln embellishes his own reference. He says, if you do this, then plainly you stand ready, saddled, bridled, and harnessed, and waiting to be driven over into the slavery extension camp of the nation, just ready to be driven over, tied together in a lot, to be driven over, every man with a rope around his neck, that halter being held by Judge Douglas. What a wonderful image. The Republicans who vote for Douglas are not only saying they don't care if slavery is voted down or voting up, they're putting themselves in the position of the slave who's got a rope tied around his neck, the halter being held by Douglas, who's going to pull them over into the slavery extension camp. Now, this is the way in which in this speech Lincoln tries to attack the notion that popular sovereignty that Douglas is championing is in any way a neutral principle. And he urges Republicans not to fall for this appeal that Douglas is making. Now, while this is vivid language, and while it's an attack on Douglas, it is a defensive maneuver because if Lincoln weren't worried about this, we wouldn't expect this kind of reference in a campaign speech. So what have we seen then about the Chicago speech? It reveals that Lincoln has indeed been placed on the defensive by Douglas. He tries to offset that with numerous attacks on Douglas to put Douglas in a weak rhetorical position, but he has to spend a good deal of his time in this speech, admittedly aggressively doing so, but defending himself and warning against the dangers that Douglas poses to the Republicans. Next time we will follow Lincoln and Douglas as they go down to Springfield and these arguments take yet another turn.